one thing that's been a common thread, over the past few years is having a central hub that everyone is committed to. And really not trying to disrupt that too much by introducing things that don't work nicely or clunky with that space. So, in terms of success, and I think this transfers into places where you're face to face all the time, right? Except for maybe when kids are checking in at different moments, having that central hub or location and a commitment for choosing supplementary tools and resources that are going to work nicely, whether that's single sign-on or just the ability to add in resources or pull them in from different spaces. That's probably number one on my list.
Welcome, everybody, back to another exciting episode of the Undisrupted Podcast. Adam, AI is all the darling of education and educational technology right now, whether it be good or bad. And so it made me think. I was talking to my brother-in-law earlier today who works in oil and gas, totally different industry. And he was telling me how, yeah, this is great that kids know how to code and all this, but I need people that can work with their hands and people that are mechanical engineers. And I was like, there's this thing called the makerspace movement. And he's like, yeah, is that still going on? I was like, is it? So my question to you is, the makerspace move, is it dead now? Or are we just like, oh yeah, that was last year's thing or like last decade's thing? I mean, where do you stand on this?
It's the flavor of the month. We have the attention span of goldfish sometimes. So it's like, ooh, squirrel. So maker spaces are still a thing because you still have the transition with library learning commons. A lot of places that have made that makerspace movement, and with makerspace, I think there's a lot of people doing some really great work out there, and there's a lot of people checking the boxes and saying, "I put a 3D printer in here, so we have a makerspace. I have a box of leftover Legos. Makerspace." So we have to be mindful of, if we're creating a makerspace, what are we trying to accomplish with that makerspace? And no different than AI. I mean, it's one of those things. What are we trying to accomplish if we're utilizing it in our spaces in schools? But I don't know. What about you?
I've always been a big fan of using your hands, working with, technology and working with maybe non-technology things. My daughters and I.
Hey, you know me. I like hands.
Oh, here we go. Yeah, they're the knuckles. Adam's knuckles have made an appearance, everybody. Let's mark it on the tape. A tape. Geez, that tells me how old I am. No, I took my daughters to a UT here at the University of Texas this weekend. We went to a girls' STEM program, and it was awesome because there were 3D printers, but there's also a lot of hands-on engineering activities. And they were super excited about it. Like, one of my daughters was like, "Dad, I want to be an engineer." And we left. And I was like, that is awesome. And it wasn't anything to do with the tech, although there was a really cool robot that was made by Boston Dynamics, a little dog robot that I was like, oh, I want that as a pet. But I do think, I think in about 10, 15 years, because of AI, coding and programming maybe not as important anymore, even though we're pushing it now. And as my brother-in-law told me, he's like, I can get any coder I want, man. I need someone that can work on machinery and work with the automated robotics and things like that. So I don't think it's dead. I think it just needs to be, I think it's just kind of at the moment put on the back burner. But I'd like to hear our guest's opinion on this. She is Monica Burns, and I can't believe it's taken us this long to have her, season 6, to have her on the show. She's a global educational consultant. She's been all over the world and back. She's an ADE. She's an author. She's a former educator, professor, done a little bit of everything in the space, and used to work for the largest school district in the world, in the country, I should say, in the New York City DOE. Monica, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So what's your take on that makerspace movement? And I know you and I have mutual friends in this, and so and like, quick shout out to Caroline Habig, who I've interviewed recently about her book, The Maker Playbook, who has, I'm sure, her own thoughts on this too. What do you think?
Oh yeah, she's a fantastic resource on all things maker learning. And for me, I think it's more about the mindset of what it means to be a maker, whether you have that physical space dedicated in your building or not, right? Are we giving students opportunities to create things, to iterate, to ask for feedback? Maybe AI comes into the equation, right, as part of those iterations. And we're talking about the kinds of questions we might ask a chatbot and all of that. But I do think it's an essential skill and important to have opportunities for students to explore lots of different things. And I think that should be part of the equation when we're planning for different opportunities for students.
Don't put it on the shelf quite yet, Adam. We're not quite done with it yet.
See, my question with AI, are we getting closer and closer to Dune? Where we're going to outlaw machines and computers and all that stuff.
Isn't it funny that we go to this though? I mean, Monica, I don't know if you've heard this, but it's the same thing with me. Like whenever I hear the AI, my brain wanders into pop culture, right? I'm like, oh, it's Terminator or it's
Yeah.
Skynet. Have you been experiencing this too around AI?
I don't think you can help it, right? The Skynet comparisons, right? Coming back to these, they're the way that we've seen it in action up until this point. So I think it's a default to go to what we imagine this to be or what someone imagined for us. This is going to look like in the future. And now, if we're doing it, doesn't it look like what it should look like, in the movie? So I think it's a natural place to go to. It can be part of our conversation, but I don't know that that's exactly what's happening here.
Yeah, we're always going to toe that line. My fear is going to be that one guy in the lab somewhere that's just pushing the envelope a little too much with everything.
Why is it
it's always one. It's always one.
Why is it got to be a guy? But yes, probably, yeah. Because we do things sometimes, yes.
So let me ask you this, Monica, because you've seen a lot of things. You get a chance to work with a lot of different districts. So what is the most fascinating or on the edge thing you've seen or heard about with AI in schools?
So, right now, a lot of my work has been around teacher or educator productivity. So, less about the kids finding this over the weekend and coming in and telling all their friends on Monday, which, right, is part of the anything new type of reality that we want to acknowledge. It's more around accelerating workflow for educators. So, some of the conversations, I've been having with that lens of AI, because it's just one perspective for thinking of use cases in education, is around write me a great email about this, rewrite my email with this tone, right? Help me think of a simpler, friendlier, stronger way to make a case for X, Y, and Z. Give me a list of ideas for, right? So some of that idea generation, some of the resource recommendation, differentiation of activities. So really not a replacement or a substitute, but just that acceleration or working smarter, not harder, right? Saving us that first pass time, right? Or that getting started jump, like just getting us in. And then we are using all of our knowledge and expertise to refine, to move things forward. And that's really where I'm, the most excited about. I think I can hold that excitement at the same time as I hold the hesitation and, and wonder about some of the scarier things that might happen or the more disruptive things that might happen in learning environments. So I'm holding on to a bunch of different feelings right now about AI.
Yeah, it just seems like Clippy has come a long way. Because before, you'd be typing, it's like, it seems like you're writing a friendly letter and it would just kind of give you those prompts. Now you're saying, oh, I would like to write a friendly letter to my friend I haven't seen in 10 years. And then have it write the letter for you. But then I could go back in and personalize it because I may not be the best wordsmith. And it gives, I think we need to look at it from that perspective, because there are some people who do struggle with writing. And but they have things they want to say. The AI may assist them in that, and then they go in and, as you said, add their own 2 cents in there, add their little seasoning, add their Zatarans on there, if you will, to give it that spicy flavor.
Yeah, and that it's such a great example that you gave there because, even though ChatGPT has been the dominant part of our conversations, or at least mine of late, I've done a fun webinar where lots of people joined in for, and people are clicking on those things, right? At the same time, I've used Grammarly for a very long time as a blog writer. And I don't disclose that at the bottom of my posts the way that I've been doing as I play around with ChatGPT. And honestly, as I use that Grammarly tool more and more, I work with that in mind, right? I write with those responses or feedback in mind. And every time I'm putting content in, I'm getting a little bit closer to whatever, I'm headed towards, if you will, right? My sentences are stronger. I'm thinking about tense as I'm writing a little bit differently because I know I'll have that prompt from that tool, to guide me down the line. So, it's a really interesting space right now. And I love that Clippy comparison because I've been trying to make connections to past experiences in my own thinking, let alone my conversations more generally around this.
I'm going to go ahead and shamefully admit this, that since there's 3 members of the EdTech Fantasy Football League on this podcast, that I've used AI to help draft a winning team this last year, but it used it with a little bit of human interaction. So like I put in like, here are the outcomes of what the scoring is going to be, what would be the best players to draft. And it spits out kind of the guide. And then I still have some human leanings, but just like we were just talking about, it's the start, it's not the end. So next year, I'm sure everybody in the league will be using AI to help draft their teams. Monica, no pressure. As the lone female in that league, I always feel bad for you anyway. But in this case, yeah, you got a leg up. You can use the AI now. Speaking of productivity, you're talking about how AI can help with that. I do think burnout is another big part of what we see a lot with technology in general. And so when you have that one new thing, it's like, okay, it's another new thing I got to think about. It almost adds another layer of anxiety and stress to a teacher following a pandemic where we were using tech heavily, in some ways uncomfortably. How do you now re-engage teachers into tech? Because I've seen, and I know you and I both do a lot of consulting around the country. We've seen some teachers are like, hey, let's just, that was a remote learning thing and we're not going to use that anymore. How do you re-engage them and say, like, this is something you can use every day?
Yeah. So one of the big areas that I always try and come back to in conversations is around, using tools that can accomplish multiple goals. So I was just at the FATC and TCA conference giving presentations that were kind of listicle, right? Like 15 things for this, right? Or 20 strategies. And I often start off by saying, like, I'm going to give you a recommendation of a tool where you might use this strategy, but I really want you to say, Monica, can I do that with fill in the blank, right? That tool that's already in your tool belt. So a lot of my work, and I think this comes back to that idea of getting burnout with like the new thing, is really leaning into the spaces or the tools that you're already pretty familiar with that you can use in a few different ways, right? There may be a one-off moment here or there, but having that confidence and capacity to introduce a particular platform to students and then just looking at those features maybe with a different lens. Like, yeah, this does have audio support or there is voice to text built in here, like, and looking at those different components as we think about thoughtful technology integration, as opposed to adding to a long list or like a heavy tool belt full of different resources. And I think that can help people feel less overwhelmed and also validate that they're doing really great work and that they already have a step in to using different tech tools and that they can come back to those same spaces that, they might have used over the past few years.
That's an idea for a session. Monica and I are going to do a session called Lightening Your Tool Belt, and it's using everyday tools that we already use and using them in different ways. I like that.
There's a lot that we saw, a lot of different tools that popped on the scene during the pandemic. Of course, a lot of things were given out free to teachers all over the place. And I am a fan of keep it simple when it comes to technology and education. But have you seen one tool that's come out recently that teachers are using that you just like, okay, everybody needs this in their toolbox?
Not AI.
Yeah, not AI, right? I know so much of our AI conversation. So I'm going to come back to some creativity tools that I think are really powerful. And again, this is like the multiple use case. I work with K-12 across different content areas. I'm always coming in with that lens. And so one that I've come back to a lot this past year, and I've done some work with their team, is Book Creator. And I really love that as a vehicle for conversations on a few different things. And for me, that's what I'm always looking for. Like, how can I talk about formative assessment, creativity, right? Great feedback, like all these things that are so important, even taking tech out of the conversation. Yet this is an opportunity for me to show how to make this more accessible or ready to differentiate for a group. And so that's one that I keep coming back to. And because, I've used it remotely with students and teachers during the pandemic. Before that, I was using it face to face in classrooms with fourth graders giving feedback to another fourth grader on the other side of the room while their teacher's peeking into all the things that they're working on, right? And now, of course, back face to face with plenty of professional learning, with educators jumping in and creating. So that's one that I really like because there's also the scale for implementation. You can use that blank page, keep it nice and simple. You might layer in comics, you might layer in templates, might layer in collaboration with everyone in the book at the same time. So there's a lot of entry points and a lot of ways to scale. So for me, right, as a professional development facilitator, it helps the conversations I'm having on a few different levels. And in a classroom setting, it gives plenty of flexibility and then common conversations around, say, a grade level team or department to talk about implementation and just best practices in general.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of applications that have multiple use cases, and big fan of also Book Creator. I like the fact they added in those other apps that you can like plug in now and do some cool things with it. I mean, that's one of those things where it just makes life simpler. It can go into any subject, any content area. My daughter actually wanted to create a book creator for our trip to the DR we took this summer. Uh, yeah, I mean, this is all on her own. But it was funny. She was like, "Daddy, I want to make a rainbow book." I was like, "What are you talking about, a rainbow book?"
I
And she kept
love
saying
that.
rainbow book. I had no idea what she was talking about, but the
Yeah.
logo is like a rainbow. And
Yeah.
she showed it to me on her ClassLink Launchpad. She was like, "Here's rainbow book." And I was like, "Oh, book creator." So yeah, it made perfect sense then.
I love that, right? I love those like so organic, like, yep, that's what it is. That's like exactly what that's right. Yep.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
My daughter loves their stickers. They're all over her room. I tweeted that out actually not too long ago, and book creators like, "Oh, we'll give you some more." I was like, "Please, she's got enough stickers. She doesn't need more." But yeah, but quick shout out book creator. Yes, that's a great tool for this, and they're doing I think a hashtag Be an Author Month for the month of March, and this comes out. This is actually live early March, so it'll be a good time to check in on what they're doing and all the great stuff that they're doing there for Be an Author Day. So. But not every tool is great. I mean, there are times when we think that there's going to be this amazing tool in ed tech and it's introduced. So I want you to put down a little bit of your historian hat and think about, over the last 10 years, 15 years, has there been something that's come out that you're like, oh, this is going to be, you're kind of like surprised that it doesn't take off. Like there's maybe, oh, this is going to be the next movement or the next thing. And then all of a sudden it just kind of dies. And maybe in a year we're talking about that with AI, although I doubt it, but you never know. What was something you could think about that's like, man, I'm just surprised this never took off.
Yeah, it's funny because as we're talking this week, I'm not going to South by Southwest EDU this year, but I've been
Oh
a few years in
no.
the past. I know it's always on my want to make it happen, and but not this year. But a few years ago, or I should say more than a few years ago, I was there doing a presentation around wearables. Right. And so wearables being, an area where if you had asked me, this might have been 7 or 8 years ago now, I would have said like 5 years from now, I think we're going to be in a much different spot with wearables. I think this is an area, and I'm not completely giving up on it, but we're so not there, right? Where I think in 6 months from now, we're going to be in a different place with AI, right? So like that timeline feels much less, aspirational, very, very present. So that's an area that I think, I thought at the time was going to move a little bit faster, not so fast, but a little bit faster than now, especially from an accessibility standpoint. That was one area that I felt really energized around wearables. I get it, that been learning at a distance in many places for many years within that time frame. So that's of course going to change the momentum of things. And even from a consumer product standpoint, you're not seeing such a wide level of adoption outside of education of wearables beyond perhaps say a Fitbit or Whoop or Apple Watch, right? So that's an area that I'm still watching, but I would say I'm not as energized about just in the sense of the timeline or what might come together.
Yeah, actually, I saw once here in Georgia, our virtual school program, they actually did tie in their wearables for students. So part of being in there for physical ed, you got a wearable. With your laptop and everything else. And so the kids got to sync it up, and that was part of their going out and moving and charting their steps and doing all that stuff. And then they also tied it into their math program. So, but to your point, it's still part of the fitness piece. We haven't really gotten beyond that, the health. Because I was with you too. Because when you had the Google Glass, of course that went nowhere. But you're thinking about a heads up display. You can have all these stats on people, and you're just thinking, I'm going to the grocery store now, and I can look at it with my glass and see things. And yeah, I don't know. We just didn't quite get there.
Somewhere Adam Bello is cringing, a former guest on the podcast. He was like also wore Google Glass on the ISTE stage once, if I remember correctly. That was a classic. Yeah, I think wearables also you have to kind of overcome. There's a financial component to it. That maybe something like Chat GPT, which is why it has longer legs because it's quickly accessible versus something where you have to purchase and buy X amount and then make a case, and then there's red tape and everything else. So probably a lot more to overcome. But yeah, I don't know that it's completely dead, but yeah, I'm with you. I think it's probably fading, that part of it.
Now, do y'all remember the wearable that they tried to push a few years back? This is probably about 10 years back by now, I think. With the 3D TVs, where they try to have the 3D
Oh
flat panel
yeah, you
TVs in the
talked about
classroom with
these.
goggles. Yeah, like that was, to your point, that was one of those things where your district had to have a bukus of money laying around to buy the TV and then the glasses, and then you had to charge the glasses. I'm like, come on, who's doing all
This
this?
is why EdTech gets a bad name sometimes in schools, because like we spend it on stuff like that maybe doesn't have the greatest thought through it. Yeah.
Yeah, but a lot of these tools and resources, they have their place. Sometimes in smaller niche markets, sometimes it's larger. I mean, like one thing that I've seen districts use, like the e-glass. I've seen they've had a presence at a lot of different shows, and it has its place. But I don't see something like that in every single classroom. I see that in certain classrooms, certain spaces, distance learning. Perfect fit there. So let me ask you this. This is actually another question I'm going to throw out to you. I like throwing little curveballs. So, but this is an easy one. So, what have you seen that has really been working with remote distance learning with districts you've worked with?
So with districts who are continuing or have a hybrid model or are working, at a distance, I would say the one thing that's been a common thread, over the past few years is having a central hub that everyone is committed to, and really not trying to disrupt that too much by introducing things that don't work nicely or clunky with that space. So in terms of success, and I think this transfers into places where you're face to face all the time, right? Except for maybe when kids are checking in at different moments, having that central hub or location and a commitment for choosing supplementary tools and resources that are going to work nicely, whether that's single sign on or just the ability to add in resources or pull them in from different spaces. That's probably number one on my list.
Yeah, you mentioned that disruption. I think that's a big part of it too, like keeping as much of the variables down as possible, and a lot of times that does mean you have that centralized hub or that platform. um, So we always end the show with this. Adam, I'll let you ask it, because sometimes I ask it. Sometimes I'm going to let you ask it. But speaking of disruption, go. I'm going to cue you up.
Yeah, that was a great segue to this last question here. So, Miss Burns, in this world that's ever changing of AI and ubiquitous technology, what is something that you do to keep yourself undisrupted?
So I try to keep all of my to dos, all of my must get dones in one really simple space. So I use a project management tool called Asana to keep track of all the things. So that means I'm not looking through an email to find what I have to do next or who I have to come back to, but that I am taking that inbox zero as my pretty close to goal, and moving in any of my tasks or to-do lists and keeping them all in that Asana one place. That means I can access it from my phone. I can add myself a quick reminder. I'm not putting it on my calendar as a don't forget, but just keeping it all in one space. And that's really helped me stay focused, mindful of what I really do need to get done and what is a distraction. And so having a project management tool, which sounds fancier than it really is, right? It's a free space for me to just keep all my things organized, has been crucial to manage all the content, all of the work that I'm doing, all the different things, and make sure it gets done.
Adam, you taking notes here? Because I know, as a newly kind of minted work from home person, I learned. I'm sitting here with a pen, because I always, whenever Monica talks, I'm always like, oh, yeah, that's a new thing. I got to try this out, because maybe Google Keep isn't for me. We're figuring out my system that'll work for me too. Uh,
Hey, well, you called her the Adam Schefter of EdTech on our draft, so she's the
she
one. Like,
really is. She's always got
I
breaking
just
news
got
with the
this
latest.
message in.
Yeah. This is Monica. Speaking of which, plug yourself quick, Monica. Where can we find out a little bit more? I mean, I of course follow you on most channels, but where do you post a lot of places? So tell us, like, kind of quickly, where do we find you and all the great work you're doing?
Yeah, so you can find me at Class Tech Tips on all of the platforms. So even TikTok. If you search for Monica Burns, which I suggest that you do for a nice laugh or a Google, you'll find, or a giggle, I should say, on Google,
A giggle
you'll
on
find
Google.
you'll find someone else. But Class Tech Tips is where you can find me in all of the spaces, including classtechtips.com, which is where I keep my podcast ready for people to find as well.
That is awesome. Well, thank you for joining us. And for our listeners out there, check out Monica's website, check out her blog, check out her Twitter, TikTok, a little bit of everything, Class Tech Tips. I love that got everything organized in that form and fashion. And for those of you out there listening, be sure to also subscribe and give us a like and a review. We'd appreciate it. We might even give you a shout out on a future show. This has been the Undisrupted Podcast, brought to you by All for Ed. He's Adam, and you can follow him at AskAdam3.
And he's Carl, and you can follow him at Mr. Hooker. And remember, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, we are better together.
And we are better
undisrupted.